Today we're going to look at how American politics evolved from the turn of the 20th century to now. By the year 1900, the power of the federal government had been steadily growing, but still would be considered weak and small compared to today's standards. The overwhelming trend of the 20th century has been the expansion of the government in power and scope, as well as the gradual extension of civil liberties to all people, regardless of color, religion, or gender. When the Progressive Era began, decades of industrialization had left their mark on politics, from the corruption and scandals to the overwhelming power of trusts and holding companies. In the year 1900, McKinley was president, a conservative who touted the Republican line of high tariffs, pro-business policies, a gold standard, and other laissez-faire philosophies. But when McKinley was shot, the new president, Teddy Roosevelt, would usher in an era of change that would come to personify the Progressive Era, and would leave lasting changes on American government. Teddy Roosevelt is considered the first progressive president. But the progressive movement started long before him. Beginning in the late 1800s, reformers began to put pressure on their state governments to make changes to address the problems of industrialization. The first progressive victories were at the state level. For example, child labor was banned not by the federal government, but by the state governments. Also, it was progressive state legislatures and courts that began to grant workers' rights, such as workers' compensation and 8-hour workdays. Innovative election procedures also began at the state level. Many states adopted the initiative, which is a bill originated by the people and then voted on in a referendum. States also implemented the recall, which was a vote to remove public officials. The direct primary and secret ballot were also state-level innovations. Teddy Roosevelt realized that the growing progressive movement and demand for change was too powerful to ignore. Though a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt was fiercely independent and pushed through many reforms that dramatically changed the role of the federal government. He approved laws that regulated railroad rates and protected consumers. He took vast expanses of public land and protected them from private land speculation by creating national parks. He used federal power to bust monopolistic trusts and negotiate between workers and owners during strikes. Teddy Roosevelt presided over the greatest expansion of federal power since the days of Lincoln. Roosevelt, after running for his second term, decided to follow Washington's lead and did not run for a third term, instead endorsing his friend and vice president, Taft. After one term, however, Roosevelt became disenchanted with Taft and decided to run for a third term. Denied the nomination by the Republican Party, Teddy Roosevelt ran in the election of 1912 on a third-party ticket, named the Bull Moose Party. The only thing this did, however, was split the Republican vote, in effect handing the victory to Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, like Teddy Roosevelt, is known for his progressive policies as president. Wilson approved a stricter antitrust act and continued to bust monopolistic trusts. He also continued policies to regulate businesses, protect workers, and ensure the safety of products for consumers. Wilson signed into law the Federal Reserve Act, which established the nation's first comprehensive banking system since the Bank of the United States was destroyed by President Jackson in the 1830s. Many amendments were made during Wilson's presidency as well. The 16th Amendment legalized the income tax. The 17th Amendment made it so senators were directly elected by the people instead of by the state legislatures. The 18th Amendment ushered in prohibition, and the 19th Amendment gave the vote to women. All of these developments under Woodrow Wilson greatly expanded the role of the federal government in the economy and society. But it doesn't stop here. Wilson was also president when Europe exploded into war in 1914. For 3 years, Wilson kept the United States out of World War. But in 1917, we were dragged into the conflict. As always, war prompts the federal government to increase its power and role in the economy. During World War I, the federal government established many agencies, such as the War Industries Board, which managed the wartime economy, the Committee of Public Information, which produced propaganda, and the Food Administration, which encouraged people to ration and save. Many Americans who had previously been staunchly isolationist turned a corner overnight and rallied to support the government's war effort. People bought war bonds, watched war movies, and planted victory gardens, all at the government's prompting. However, a large number of people were still anti-war and protested against it. Due to this, the federal government passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917, which targeted socialists, labor leaders, German Americans, and other radicals. These laws made it a crime to speak out against the war. Though an obvious infringement on free speech and laws that would not be tolerated today, the Supreme Court upheld the laws in the case Schenck versus the United States, stating that in a time of war, the federal government could limit some aspects of free speech to protect national security. Fortunately, the laws were repealed after the war was over, but the Supreme Court precedent was set and still exists today. The curtailment of civil liberties during the war with the Espionage and Sedition Acts continued into the 1920s after the war was over. During the war, fear had prompted the imprisonment of political radicals who spoke out against the war. After the war, fear continued, mostly due to the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the establishment of a communist regime there. In America, the Red Scare began in 1919, a wave of panic among conservatives that a communist revolution might happen in America too. A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, hunted down suspected communists, socialists, and anarchists, deporting foreign-born radicals without trial. Known as the Palmer Raids, these acts clearly trampled people's civil rights, especially when it became clear that there was no evidence of any plot to overthrow the U.S. government. The trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrant radicals, was also illustrative of the irrational fears of the time. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested in 1920 for a robbery and murder, but the evidence was circumstantial and the judge was clearly biased against them. Despite the lack of proof, the executions went forward, much to the shock of people all over the world. Fortunately, the fears of the Red Scare abated, but things were different politically in the 1920s. Before World War I, both Democrats and Republicans had embraced progressive reforms, but the war had cooled people's reformist zeal. And the Red Scare had introduced political intolerance once again. The 1920s were dominated by conservative Republican presidents and policies under Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. These men reversed many progressive reforms. They raised tariffs. They lowered taxes. And they stopped busting trusts and instead targeted unions. Overall, the goal of these men was to pursue laissez-faire policies and remove the hand of government from the economy. These philosophies did contribute to a booming economy in the 1920s, but the boom was superficial at best and contributed directly to the stock market crash in 1929. When the recession did hit, the laissez-faire philosophies of Republican Herbert Hoover proved inadequate to deal with the economic crisis. President Hoover held on fiercely to his belief in small government, which had two fatal consequences. One, it caused the people of America to lose faith in him, and it caused them to do too little too late to catch the failing economy. And two, as a result, when the charismatic Franklin Delano Roosevelt challenged Hoover in 1932, the people of America fell in love with him and his promise for a New Deal of government action to directly aid people in need. This approach was almost the opposite of that of Hoover. The New Deal of FDR was the most massive government welfare spending spree ever seen. Scores of agencies were created, and billions of dollars were spent on direct aid, welfare, pensions, work programs, subsidies, and more. The New Deal also expanded the regulatory power of the federal government by creating rules for the stock market and banks, ensuring bank deposits, setting price supports, establishing minimum wages, and legalizing the collective bargaining power of unions, and much more. It cannot be overemphasized how dramatically the New Deal changed the size and scope of American government. The American government that we recognize today was born in the New Deal. Many Americans idolized FDR for his efforts to help people during the Great Depression. Most notably, African Americans began to vote Democrat in large numbers during the 1930s. Previously, blacks had voted Republican because it had been the party of the North during the Civil War. But under FDR, the Democratic Party was beginning to shift away from its racist roots. But not everyone loved FDR and his New Deal. The most vocal critics were conservatives, who believed that the government was getting too big and spending too much money. In fact, the Supreme Court, which was dominated by conservatives, found two New Deal programs unconstitutional, the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Recovery Act, because they overstepped the powers granted to the federal government in the Constitution. President FDR, in response, proposed a bill to Congress to increase the number of Supreme Court justices to 12, known as the Court Packing Bill. But Congress saw through this political ploy to change the makeup of the court and vetoed the bill. But FDR did get his wish in a different manner. Since he was president for so long, 4 terms, the only president to be elected for more than 2 terms, he was able to appoint to the Supreme Court 7 liberal judges that later on upheld his New Deal policies. During FDR's long term as president, 3 constitutional amendments were passed. The 20th Amendment shortened the lame duck period by 2 months, changing the inauguration date for a president from March to January. The 21st Amendment ended prohibition. And the 22nd Amendment, passed after FDR's death, which limited a president to being elected for 2 terms only. President FDR is one of our nation's most famous, not only for the New Deal, but also because of World War II. The New Deal greatly expanded the size of the federal government, but the New Deal was nothing compared to the war. Most historians agree that the government spending of the New Deal was inadequate to pump prime the economy, and the massive defense spending and economic mobilization of World War II is what ended the Great Depression, as you can see in this chart. Interestingly, the same conservatives who had opposed the deficit spending of the New Deal didn't object to the tenfold increase in government spending for the war effort. Despite the controversy, the fact is that the size and role of the federal government expanded even more during World War II in the effort to mobilize the economy and workforce for such a massive war. 3 examples stand out as being different from previous wars. First, in World War II, the government required rationing, unlike during World War I when it was voluntary. Second, during World War II, the federal government invested heavily in scientific research, such as the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. And third, the federal government during World War II went much further than ever before by creating internment camps for Japanese Americans who were deemed by the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus the United States to be security threats to the United States in a time of war. All 3 of these show the extent to which the federal government's power controlled society during World War II. After World War II, America became a world superpower and immediately became involved militarily and politically in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. This was different from World War I. After World War I, Americans retreated into isolationism and wanted to avoid foreign conflicts. But there is one stark similarity between these 2 periods, the post-World War I 1920s and the post-World War II 1950s, fears of communism. In the 1920s, the Red Scare targeted radicals. In the 1950s, the communist witch hunts of the House of Un-American Activities and Senator McCarthy rocked society and affected more people than in the 1920s. For almost 5 years, Congress investigated, blacklisted, and harassed individuals who they said were communists, even though it wasn't a crime to believe in communism and almost no evidence was ever found. The most infamous investigations were in the film industry. 10 Hollywood actors, producers, and writers were actually sent to jail for contempt because they refused to cooperate with the House of Un-American Activities Committee and name names of their friends. Fortunately, this irrational hysteria simmered down after Senator McCarthy was discredited in the media and lost his seat in Congress. But the period destroyed many innocent people's lives. Probably the most influential event of the Cold War was the conflict in Vietnam that the United States was involved in for almost 2 decades. The American public had generally supported the president's actions in the Cold War since Truman. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson asked Congress for, quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, end quote, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And Congress agreed, in effect giving the president broad military powers to send troops to Vietnam to stop communist North Vietnam from taking over South Vietnam. This represented an important trend that had been happening since the Cold War began: the expanding power of the executive branch in times of crisis to use the military without a declaration of war. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution gave the president the power to wage war in Vietnam without the politically difficult task of getting a declaration of war from Congress. This is, in fact, the way all presidents since World War II have used American military forces. As the Vietnam War progressed and stagnated, American anti-war sentiment increased. Politically, America in the 1960s became more divided than ever over issues of war, but also segregation, women's rights, and environmentalism. The Vietnam War made vocal the people's growing frustration with their government. As a result, when the war was over, 2 important changes were made. First, the 26th Amendment was passed. During the war, many young people had protested against a war in which they could be drafted, but couldn't vote for or against. The 26th Amendment finally lowered the voting age to 18, the same as the age a man can be drafted. Second, after the Vietnam War was over, Congress passed the War Powers Act of 1973 over President Nixon's veto. The law attempted to rein in the president's expanded war-making power by forcing the president to inform Congress within 48 hours of sending military forces into a hostile area without a declaration of war. The law also declared that the president can have troops in a hostile area for no longer than 90 days, unless he gets congressional approval. While the law did curb some of the president's war-making powers, it hasn't prevented more undeclared wars from starting. The post-World War II era saw many other political changes. Beginning in the 1950s, the civil rights movement began to gain momentum, starting with the Supreme Court. For decades, African Americans had tried to challenge the 1893 decision Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld state segregation laws. In 1954, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court made a historic decision that reversed the separate but equal doctrine and declared that separate is inherently unequal in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. This was the first major legal victory of the civil rights movement. From that point forward, the people used their protests, boycotts, and growing popular support to put pressure on the federal government to force Southern states to end segregation. President Eisenhower used federal troops to force the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Kennedy used federal troops to allow James Meredith to attend the University of Mississippi. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation in all public facilities. And he also signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned practices such as literacy tests and grandfather clauses. The 24th Amendment was also passed, which banned poll taxes. The evolution of the Democratic Party into the Liberal Party and pro-civil rights party happened during this era. Previously, the Democratic Party had been the party of the South, of segregation, and of the Ku Klux Klan. However, starting with Roosevelt, more and more liberals, progressives, and blacks began to vote for Democratic candidates they liked. Then, when President Truman integrated the armed forces by executive order, the Southern Democrats revolted. In the 1948 election, Southern Democrats broke rank and formed a third political party called the Dixiecrats that ran on a platform of segregation. Despite this, Truman still won the election. But it was at this moment that many pro-segregation Democrats began to vote Republican. After 2 terms by Republican President Eisenhower, the 1960s were dominated by Democrats, Kennedy and Johnson, who were perceived as a liberal choice for voters. President Johnson, famous for his role in escalating the Vietnam War, is also famous for his series of domestic reforms called the Great Society. Comparable in scope to the New Deal of FDR, the Great Society continued to increase the size of the federal government, which was also growing due to the war in Vietnam. The Great Society expanded the role of the government to include giving health care to the poor and elderly, creating housing projects, protecting the environment and consumers, and alleviating urban poverty. During this era, the Supreme Court, still under Chief Justice Earl Warren, made many other historic decisions. Some of those include legalizing abortion, banning affirmative action quotas, defending the rights of the accused, protecting anti-war demonstrations, banning prayer in public schools, and requiring congressional reapportionment to reflect one person, one vote. LBJ's Great Society programs were very popular, but the failure of the Vietnam War cost him his presidency. In 1968, LBJ said he would not be running for re-election, opening the doors for a very controversial election year. The Democrats fought amongst each other for the nomination, disagreeing over Vietnam and civil rights. Like in 1948, pro-segregation Democrats broke rank and nominated their own candidate on a third party called the American Independent Party. The disagreements within the Democratic Party enabled the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, to win in 1968. The election of Nixon began a surge in conservatism that lasted until the 2000s. Nixon's message to the American public, to what he called the silent majority, did resonate with many. Conservatives were frustrated at the fast pace of change, with civil rights, anti-war protesters, and the counterculture hippie movement in the colleges. Conservatives also objected to the expanding power of the federal government and the growing budget deficit. In addition, conservatives complained about the activist Supreme Court that was allowing abortions, protecting criminals, and protecting African Americans. The perception of Nixon as a strong conservative who could be tough against communism was abruptly shattered shortly after he was re-elected in 1972. First, Nixon lost a Supreme Court case called the New York Times versus the U.S. In this case, the Nixon administration argued that the federal government could force a newspaper from printing leaked government documents, called the Pentagon Papers, which showed that the government had been lying to the American people for years about the Vietnam War. The Supreme Court found otherwise, stating that the newspapers have freedom of the press. This event exposed Nixon as being out of touch with constitutional principles, as well as the lies his administration had been using in the continuing Vietnam conflict. But, most dramatically, in 1973, the Watergate scandal began. Evidence emerged implicating Nixon's re-election committee of using illegal means to win the 1972 election. When a congressional investigation began, Nixon was asked to turn over the tapes he recorded in his White House office, but he refused. This standoff went all the way to the Supreme Court in the case U.S. versus Nixon in 1974. Nixon argued that he had executive privileges that protected his right to privately record his conversations and keep them secret. The Supreme Court found otherwise and required Nixon to hand over the tapes. When it became clear that incriminating information would be released, Nixon resigned. Vice President Ford, as the new president, pardoned Nixon in 1975. The Watergate incident, as well as the Vietnam War, left indelible marks on American politics. In the years after Watergate and Vietnam, society and politics remained tumultuous. Civil rights protests grew more violent, and the Cold War continued. For the most part, conservative presidents have controlled politics. Since 1976, Republican presidents have held power for 20 years, while Democrats have only had 16. Including the first term of current President Barack Obama. The upcoming election of 2012 would be very contentious. Conservative backlash to President Obama's policies on health care, taxes, and the current economic recession will dominate the debate, as they have throughout history. It will be very exciting to see what happens.